Hi, I'm Marc Liebman. I'm a naval aviator, author, historian, and a retired Navy captain. And today we're going to talk about a skip bombing attack in the Mediterranean in December 1942. The airplane of choice in this case is going to be a Martin B-26. I'll get into why about that in a second. But the Allies were attempting to cut the supply line between Italy and Sicily and the German forces that were trapped in Tunisia after the Battle of El Alamein and the invasion of North Africa called Operation Torch. So I've written a few articles about the Martin B-26. This is them in chronological order from the oldest to the newest. And in fact, the bottom one that was published in March 26 literally is a kind of a first-person account of what it's like to fly B-26 on a skip bombing mission. This presentation is dedicated to my dad, who was one of those pilots that flew the Martin B-26 on skip bombing missions. And what's really interesting about his background during the war is that when he finished flight training, he was headed for P-38s, and the Army Air Corps said, nope, we're going to send you to B-26s, and oh, by the way, you'll get your multi-engine experience in the 34th Bomb Squadron. He flew 85 missions between November of 1942 and November of 1943. About 26 of them were I think skip bombing missions. That's based on reading the mission reports. So skip bombing was used by the RAF and the United States Army Air Forces, the Italians and the Soviets during World War II. I'm not going to get into a deep history, but the first recorded low-level attack that used one of the techniques I'm going to describe in this video was done by the RAF in September 4th, which is 3 days after the war started in 1939. But the people who are the Air Force or the pilots who perfected this really flew for the 5th Air Force beginning in early 1942, and they flew in the Southwest Pacific, primarily out of New Guinea and Northern Australia against the Japanese. But again, in 1942, we invade North Africa. We've got the Afrika Corp trapped in Tunisia, and part of the strategy was to cut off their fuel supply and materials coming from Italy, and skip bombing was a good way to sink ships. So I want to talk about the difference between masthead bombing and skip bombing. So masthead bombing is essentially a low altitude bombing attack, typically 100 to 200 feet. The altitude's not really that important other than the fact that it's low and you're coming in fast. And the idea is to drop the bombs that either hit close aboard alongside, so the explosion causes the ship's plates below the waterline to split and let water into the ship, or to actually hit the ship and explode. And typically the drop point is somewhere, depending on the altitude, speed, and a bunch of other factors, somewhere around 100 to 200 yards from the ship. Note, when the bomb comes out of the airplane, I get this all the time, it looks like it's dropping straight down. But what's happening is when the bomb leaves the airplane, the instant it hits the airstream, it is going the same speed as the airplane. And so as a result is, it slowly begins to fall as drag and gravity take over, and ultimately it will be going straight down. But the pictures you see in Masters of the Air and other programs where the bombs are coming straight down, that's true. But the moment they leave the airplane in that string, they are in fact going the same speed as the airplane, and ultimately they'll take this arc down towards the ground. And skip bombing is an attack which has a much higher hit probability than masthead bombing. The idea is like skipping rocks across a lake. In this case, you only want to do it once, as opposed to being a really good rock skipper, getting it to skip 3 or 4 times. And so the bomb is released from the airplane, flying right around 100 feet. You use the height of the bridge or the mast as kind of a judgment of height. And the idea is to have the bomb hit about 200 or 300 yards from the ship, and then bounce off the water and then go into the side of the ship, or again explode close aboard. It has a much higher hit probability, and the trick in this attack is you want to be going as fast as you can go, because you are literally going to, like in masthead bombing, you're literally going to fly over the ship, who's not going to be happy that you've just dropped bombs onto their boat. So a wide variety of aircraft were tried by both sides. Again, I'm not going to get into the history, but I thought this was an interesting list because the Soviet Air Force did it with Lend-Lease A-20s and the IL-12. The Italians did it with 2 different kinds of airplanes. The Brits did it with a host of them. And most of the skip bombing done by the United States Army Air Force was done in the A-20 and the B-25, although early on in the war, the B-26 was used as well, and the Brits used the A-20, the Blenheim, the Beaufighter, and the Mosquito. The next part of this is, here's the mission. The 34th Bomb Squadron mission today is to conduct a skip bombing attack on a German convoy headed from Palermo in Sicily for Tunis. Now, this is in many ways a fictitious attack because I'm not picking a specific date, a specific mission with a specific target, only because when I was reading the mission reports, they never would have things like the exact heading of the ships, how many ships were in the convoy, what the mix of the ships. It was just a convoy, and they would report how many hits they got or thought they got. So we're in the briefing room, and the mission commander and intelligence officer tells us that we're going to fly a mix of our B-26As, Bs, and Cs. I'll talk about the different airplanes in a second, but the 34th Bomb Squadron at this time of the war was flying a mix of those three airplanes. They flew As across the Atlantic, and if you watch the story or the video called The Thunderbirds Go to War, it's on my YouTube channel, I tell the story of how they got to North Africa in November of 1942. So they flew A's, but they began to be replaced by B's, and as the B's and the A's began to wear out, got shot up, got shot down, whatever, they got C's. And today's fighter escort's going to be B-38s. I'm not going to get too much into what they do in the combat between the P-38s and if there are any Luftwaffe escorts, because it just clutters up the story. But we're going to go out and we're going to attack an 8-ship convoy that includes 2 tankers, 6 freighters, and 4 destroyers. And we can expect that the Germans will have some Ju-88s and Me-110s overhead and they might be pretty aggressive. And we have a rough idea of the convoy's location because intelligence has told us when they left Palermo and what their course and speed was, but we don't know their exact course. So we're gonna have to go find them, and I'll get into how you did that in a second. And then the Italian Navy, just so you know, was using Soldate class destroyers in this convoy as escort. More often than not, there was a mix, but in the interest of simplicity, I just said we're going to have 3 Italian Navy Soldate class destroyers. By the way, the one in this picture survived the war and was used by the Italian Navy well into the 60s. Okay, so here is the map, and this is again a stylized map, but we're going to take off from Telegerma Airfield in northeastern Algeria, which is where the 34th has been based since right after its arrival. And we're going to fly out to sea, and then we're going to head northeast towards where we think the convoy is to intercept it, bomb the convoy, turn around, fly home. As you can see, the convoy has come out of Palermo and it's making a dogleg, because what they did is they would go up that way and then steam south directly towards Tunis. So we're hoping to catch them someplace between Tunisia and Sicily. Okay, I talked about the 3 different models of the B-26 that the 34th Bomb Squadron flew. The big differences between the A, B, and C are threefold. Number one, the B's and C's are heavier in terms of max takeoff weight, and they have 100 more horsepower per engine. So the A's and B's have 1850 per R2800. The C's have 1900. The A's were max takeoff weight was 34,000 pounds. The B's and C's is 37. The other big changes are the fact that there was more machine guns in each of the B's and C's. There was a powered turret in the tail, and the C's had the package guns underneath the nose or the cockpit of the C model. And the other big difference is the A's would cruise at 315 miles an hour. I'm using miles an hour because that's what they used in those days, at 15,000 feet at roughly 75% power. And you can see the C model is a lot slower. Its cruising speed, same power setting, same altitude, is about 40 knots slower, or 50 some odd miles an hour. Okay, so the crew of the Bronco is typically on a skip bombing mission, a radio operator who's going to function also as the bombardier navigator. Most of the B-26 squadrons didn't have a bombardier assigned to each airplane. They had lead bombardiers who would fly in the leading of the bombing formations when they would do level bombings. The airplane had 2 bomb bays. Normally the aft bomb bay was not used. You had a radio operator that sat in a compartment behind the pilot and the co-pilot. The top turret gunner was also the airplane's crew chief, and you had a tail gunner. Again, on level bombing missions, when you're above 8,000 feet, the ventral gun positions were manned. but on a skip bombing mission where we don't expect Luftwaffe fighters to be coming up from below and behind, we're not carrying the guy because he's extra weight. Now, this actually happens to be a painting I pulled off Marc Skyling's website. It's an actual painting or illustration of Bronco, which is one of the 2 airplanes my father flew in World War II in the 34th Bomb Squadron. In fact, this is the airplane they actually flew across the Atlantic. The other one he flew was Coffin, which is a terrible name for an airplane. Coffin was the first B-26 to survive 100 missions, and they brought it back to the U.S., where ultimately it was destroyed in an accident. And Bronco was destroyed in a landing accident after it was shot up on a mission after my dad left North Africa. So here's the office, or the cockpit is where we're going to sit. And there's a couple things I want to point out about that. This cockpit is actually of an A model, and it's at the Fantasy of Flight Museum in Florida. And note that there are no instruments on the side of the co-pilot, which is the right side of the airplane. And also in this photo, the rudder pedals are collapsed or retracted so that you get access to underneath the piece of plywood, the passageway between the radio operator's compartment and the bombardier's compartment. Now in flight, that panel is normally a piece of aluminum, and it's generally latch closed, but I thought I'd point that out. So the rudder pedals fold back down once the panel's in place, but the co-pilot does not have brakes. So the only brakes on the airplane are applied by the pilot. And also, oh, by the way, the only armor plate in the cockpit is behind the pilot seat, not the co-pilot seat. So in talking to several people who fly or play video games, I see them moving throttles. I thought I'd spend a few minutes talking about all the things that you needed to use when you're flying a large radial engine. So you have the throttles, you have mixture, and I'll talk about these later on. The prop control levers obviously have landing gear and flaps, but we also had cowl flaps we had to deal with, oil cooler shutters, and the supercharger controls to the engines. The R2800 had a 2-stage supercharger. Normally you didn't shift it unless you were going above 12,000 feet. So in this case, we're not going to use it. But all these things become part of the checklist and things that you're doing, so you're not just moving the throttle. So, because when you move the throttle, typically you're taught, at least in the Navy, when you advance the throttle, the first thing that went forward was the mixture, unless it was in auto-rich. Then you move the props to get to the right RPM, and then you move the throttles forward. And if you were reducing power, it was the exact reverse. You pull the throttles back, then the RPM, and then the mixture lever. And oh, by the way, when you're reducing power or you're at high power settings, you got to figure out what you can do with the oil coolers and the cowl flaps. So it's not just pushing the throttles forward and back. And I'll talk about the trimming later on, but the rudder trim was in a wheel that was overhead that you went like this to have it turn left to right. And then the aileron trim lever is actually right next to the supercharger, the cowl flaps, and then the elevator trim is right next to the pilot's right knee. The other exciting thing is that the R2800s, like most radial engines, use fuel in prodigious rates at sometimes. So normally when you plan a mission like this, somebody, usually it's the pilot, but sometimes it's the navigator, will sit down and figure out a fuel flow chart. And this is a highly simplified one. It's typical to what we use in the Navy, something we used to call a kneeboard card. But essentially you start with the leg. Normally you'd have heading, but in this case I didn't bother to put it in there. How fast you're going to go, how long you're going to fly that leg, how many gallons of fuel you're going to burn at the consumption rate, and then the fuel flow, and then how much fuel you're going to consume on that leg, and then how much is left. So the bottom line is we're going to consume all but about 162 gallons of our fuel using those typical power settings. Now, those are pulled from a series of pilot operating handbooks. Okay, so this is a printed copy because I have a scanned copy because the originals are in museums of the B-26 A and B model pilot operating instructions. It's 114 pages long and it has some fuel charts and other things in it. So I pulled stuff out of this one. And the important thing about this is when we're flying this mission, this didn't exist. It was not promulgated until early 1943. So what did the crews use? Well, they had mimeograph sheets that came from Martin based on calculations by their engineers on what the fuel consumption should be. And then when they're training in the airplanes before they came to North Africa, they began to record them to develop their own power settings. Unfortunately, I don't have copies of those charts. I wish I did, because it's really interesting. I do have some data from talking to my dad and some other sources. So I'm using these power settings strictly because I've based them on this one, and also a 1944 version for the C model B-26. And by the way, what's really interesting is you can see when you look at these publications, the evolution of the model. Of the manuals. So this one's, like I said, 114 pages. The one that came out a year later is almost 200. So we take off. So again, you're going to go to max, or what we call maximum takeoff power, or military power, whatever term you want to use, full throttle. It's 52 inches of manifold pressure. The supercharger enables you to go almost 2 times the atmospheric pressure, which is 29.92 on a standard day, but figure 30 inches for ballpark purposes. So you're getting 22 inches more manifold pressure than you would if you didn't have the supercharger, which means more power. You're going to set the RPM at 2,700, which is essentially all the way forward. The mixture set in auto rich. And then the fuel burn during the takeoff until we pull it back on the initial climb is 552 gallons per hour. Now don't freak out, because you're not going to be at this power setting for more than about 4 or 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, but the fact is you're gulping fuel down. The mixture in the B-26 had 3 positions: idle cutoff, which meant no fuel going to the engine; had auto lean, which is an automated lean setting, which the pressure injection carburetor figures out based on altitude, temperature, and other sensors; and then auto rich, which was pretty much maximum fuel flow, again based on temperature, altitude, and a couple other conditions. And you could also adjust it in between those 2 positions, but normally you would put it up on takeoff in auto rich, so you didn't have to deal with it. So we're going to take off. We start down the runway. Again, the pilot has brakes. He'll use differential throttle, which means that to turn left, he'd add a little bit of right engine, or right power on the engine, right side, and a little bit of left brake. Airplane will turn, you get it lined up with the runway, and you start down the runway. Now, back in 1942, we didn't have the conventional V speeds that we do today: V1, V2, V3, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not going to use them, but I'm going to give the speeds here. So essentially, you're committed to go flying in the B-26 once you get to about 90 miles an hour. That's V1. You rotate. The airplane stays on the ground. It lifts off at about 110 miles an hour. And here's the most important part of the flight, at least the takeoff. As we define minimum control airspeed, which is VMC in modern technology, it's the minimum single engine control speed. So we want to get to 140 miles an hour as fast as we can, because below that, we're going to have difficulty controlling the airplane at full throttle. So once we break ground, the airplane, it's gear up, flaps up as fast as you can. We're climbing at about 160 miles an hour, and to get to about 1,000 feet, where you do the first major power reduction, and that's when we set climb power, which is 40 inches of manifold pressure, 2,400 RPM. I use 172 miles an hour because that's what's in the manual. And what the air crews used to do is they used to put piece of white tape on the airspeed indicator, so you knew where various key speeds were, like VMC, best climb airspeed, et cetera, et cetera. So just for the sake of discussion, our max takeoff weight was, when we pushed the throttles forward, was 34,000 pounds. We're carrying 400 or 500 pound bombs in the forward bomb bay, and we got, like I said, a full bag of fuel, 962 gallons. And oh, by the way, it's 100 octane at auto lean, and it's 130 octane at max power. So it's called 100, 130 octane gasoline. It's it burns pretty well. So we climb it out, and someplace after we go feet wet, which is the point where we leave the coast of North Africa and Algeria. We're now out over the Mediterranean. The P-38s join us. Normally they'll fly 10 to 15,000 feet above us in a crisscrossing pattern, because their cruising speed is a little faster than ours. Although one of the advantages of the B-26, it was fast enough so they didn't have to do too much S-ing. And the other airplanes like B-17, B-24, which are now cruising in the low 200s, they're going to have to do a lot of crisscrossing to stay with you. Again, we're going to level off at 8,000 feet because there's no reason to go much higher. Once we level off, the mixture comes back to auto lean, the throttle comes back to 33 inches, and we're going to set the power for 223 RPM and get a cruising speed somewhere around 260 miles an hour, and we're only burning 228 gallons of fuel an hour. And again, the cruising speed is dictated by the slowest airplane in the formation. So if you got somebody who's not generating full power, or in this case the B-26Cs, they can't go as fast, because if they try to go as fast as we can go at the same cruising speeds, they're going to burn more gas. And if you burn more gas, it means you may not have enough to get back to home plate. So we're now in the cruising formation. And what we do is the squadron leader has us go from the traditional what's called finger four. So you have 4 airplanes in a flight. So you have the flight lead, and the flight lead, his wingman, the second element lead, and his wingman. So they're in the finger four. We've got 2 of them. We're on the right side as the 4 B-26As. There are 4 B-26Cs leading the squadron. And then we have 2 B models off to the left. And so what he orders us to fly into what's called a scouting line. Now, a scouting line is essentially you get wingtip to wingtip about a mile apart, and what it does is it enables you to see a visual horizon with 10 airplanes or 12 airplanes of about 125 miles. So this enables you to pretty much see, not quite from Sicily to North Africa, but you get to see most of it, and assuming the sky is clear. So we're going to stay at this scouting line until somebody sees a target. They see the target. Whoever sees it calls out its location. The squadron commander then begins to assign targets. Not everybody attacks the same ship. So everybody, assuming in this case, there's 10 ships. So 2 ships get 2 airplanes. Everybody else gets 1 airplane. Normally, in this case, the tankers would get 2 airplanes, but sometimes they'd assign 2 destroyers to 2 airplanes for the destroyers. The other thing is that normally the C models would be assigned to attack the warships because they have the 4 package guns. So as you're making your attack, you can strafe using the nose gun held by the bombardier navigator / radio operator, as well as the package guns, which are fired by the pilot. So you start on down, and literally you lower the nose to about 15-20 degrees below the horizon, and you're coming down as fast as you can. Normally they come down right at the beginning of what we would call the yellow arc. Today it's 350 to 390 miles an hour depending on the airplane, and you level off at 100 feet above the water. Now understand that when you level off, there is no radar altimeter in the airplane. You have set the barometric altimeter based on the altimeter setting back at Telegerma, so it may be off. And anybody who's flown low altitude over water will tell you it's very hard to judge your altitude at low altitude. So how did you do it? Well, you looked at the ships you're about to attack. Essentially, the top of the bridge on a merchant ship is about 100 feet off the water. So what do you do is you put the top of the over the bombardier's compartment and put that level with the top of the bridge, and away you come. And it's about 100 feet, and you check that with the altimeter, and if it's close enough, it's close enough. If not, you adjust. But now you're flying at 350 miles an hour or so, 100 feet off the water. And so as you approach the ship, when you get within range, the bombs are set to drop sequentially roughly a second apart, and you're skidding the airplane either left or right, depending on which side you're coming from, and you want to lead the ship a little bit. The idea is to spread the bombs out so that they're kind of in a pattern, and you say you have 1 bomb, 2 bombs, 3 bombs, 4 bombs, and hopefully one of them will hit. And as you're coming at the ship, and you're smoking along at 300 miles an hour at full throttle, and now you're back to 552 gallons an hour, the bombardier, the radio operator who's playing bombardier in the nose, has 3 functions. 1, he opens the bomb bay doors. 2, he drops the bombs and then closes the bomb bay doors. And 3, he uses the handheld 50 cal in the nose to strafe the ship. So he's doing all of that. So he opens the bomb bay doors on your command. He drops the bombs on your command, and between that, he's firing the 50 cal in front of him. So he's a little busy. You can feel the airplane decelerate as the bomb bay doors come open. But then as soon as the 4 bombs, which is 2,000 pounds of weight, leave the B-26, you can feel the airplane get lighter, and then you close the bomb bay doors. So again, you begin to accelerate. So normally you've decelerated, depending on which model you're flying, from 300 plus miles an hour down to in the 280s when the bomb bay door open, because it's just a huge amount of drag. But as soon as they close, again, the airplane's at full power and it starts to accelerate again. By the time you pass the ship, you're back in on the good side of 300 miles an hour. So now what happens? Oh, by the way, as you pass over the ship, the guy in the tail gunner, his job is to do 2 things: strafe the ship with the tail guns and also take pictures. He is your, what we would call today, the bomb damage assessment. In many cases, he's got a camera, and hopefully he can call out good hits. And then as you pass a ship, you generally bank to pass a stern, and then drop back down to 100. You climb, bank, and drop back down to 100 feet and head away from the convoy. Once you clear the convoy and you stop receiving fire, you start to turn back to join the formation, which is now headed back towards Telegerma. And there's a heading that's been pre-briefed, or a course, excuse me, that's been pre-briefed, and you join up. Typically, the join up is a little faster because you want to get out of Indian country as fast as you can. So you're climbing at 220, so it's a shallower climb. And you can leave the mixture back at auto lean for this because you've got the power back, but you're still climbing. And that's again the pilot has a choice going mixture auto rich or auto lean or someplace in between. But typically on these missions it was either a mixture rich or auto lean. So when we get back to base, here's what the debrief is. So we hit a 8,000 ton merchant ship with 2 of our bombs as observed by the tail gunner. He says the ship was dead in the water on fire. He observed a couple other ships. We didn't see any fighters. There's no damage to our airplane, and we landed with less than an hour of gas with about 162 gallons. And one of our airplanes was hit by a 20 millimeter shell, had a feathered engine, et cetera, et cetera. What my dad told me was the 34th lost far less airplanes in skip bombing missions, as hairy as they sounded, than they did when they were doing level bombing. And the reason being was the flak was less, they didn't have to deal with fighters, and they're in harm's way for right around 5 to 7 minutes. So they really weren't taking flak until they started down and they were within range of the larger guns on the destroyers, which in this case was 4.7 inch naval guns. And then once they dropped the bombs, hopped over the ship, within minutes they were out of range of the guns. This contrasted when they were doing level bombing at somewhere between 10 and 15,000 feet. They're in formation, they got fighters coming at them, they got flak for long periods of time until they got, again, turned back west to go back to Telegerma. So the loss rate on the skip bombing missions was a lot less than it was in the level bombing. So if you want to read more or want to see more, if you like this, please go visit my YouTube channel and subscribe. I'm not looking for money, I'm just looking for subscribers. And also on my website, there's 2 interesting sections that if you're an aviation buff, you might find interesting reading. One's called From the Hex Seat. It's about flying helicopters. I did a fair amount of that in my Navy career. And then the other is about fun and dumb things in flying machines. The things that either I did or I know other people did. Again, they're stories that are designed to make you smile, make you wonder what the heck they were thinking at the time, and maybe even scare the heck out of you. So enjoy reading those things. And also, as I mentioned earlier, I'm an author. These are the 14 books that I have produced. They're in 3 different series. Strangely enough, none of them are about World War II. But you can find out more about those on my webpage, which is on the slide. Thank you and have a good day, and I hope you subscribe.